Okay, today I want to talk about Hellenism, the Hellenistic period, and the most famous genre for development out of this period, and that is apocalyptic literature. So you're probably already aware of the term Hellenism, as in Greek life and culture. After Alexander the Great conquered this region, the minimal influence of Greek life was now pretty major. Alexander appreciated other cultures, but he really thought that the best system in the world was the Greek system. And so he attempted to turn all these countries into little Greek states in some ways. Now, the biggest problem, though, for the Jews was this: polytheism versus monotheism. So a monotheistic culture and a polytheistic culture, no matter what other things you can agree on, especially in the ancient world, this was very, very difficult for them to overcome. But in all cases, syncretism, which your textbook talks about, syncretism is the mixing of cultures, and it's inevitable. And so as a minority culture within this larger Greek world, a lot of the internal dialogue of the Jewish world, whether it be Jerusalem, whether it be Alexandria, whether it be Palestine, Babylon, Palestine, whatever, was how much is too much? So how much can you acculturate to the Greek culture and still be a good Jew? And this was a wide there are wide varieties of answers to this. Everything from an absolute closed off position to relative openness to this. Some of the ways that you might have already come up against this in the Bible without even knowing about it, for example, is in Acts, when we get the appointment of the first deacons. It's because the Hellenists, the widows of the Hellenists, were not being fed properly. Well, the Hellenists were Jews. They were just Greek-speaking Jews. But here, even in the church, the earliest church, obviously, who had converted to Christianity, they saw themselves as separate groups. Paul also is another example of a Hellenistic Jew. He had studied and he was part of the reason why his writings are so good is at the technical level is because he was trained as in Greek. So here's some examples, but it's always a problem for a religion that is a minor culture in a larger world. And so some elements continue, you just can't stop it. But everything from wearing beards, not wearing beards, going naked in the gymnasium, which was against the Jewish sense of modesty, circumcision, all these were issues that began to divide Jewish groups from other Jewish groups. And the question becomes, who decides who's a good Jew? We see Christian groups doing this today in our culture. Who decides who's a good Christian? Can you drink? Can you dance? Can you wear makeup? Can you wear pants? I've been in cultures where all of those things were no-nos and where they're not. So the same kind of thing. So into this mix comes one of the most influential genres of the Hebrew Bible in many ways, both in Judaism, Christianity, and in cultures that have been affected by Judaism or Christianity in some way. So when we talk about apocalyptic thought, literature, writing, apocalyptic is a modern term that we have given to a group of writings and thought, and I'm going to expound on this in a bit, writings and a worldview that share common writings and a worldview that are held in common even among different groups. So it is both a literary and a sociological phenomenon. Which makes it really fascinating, and it's not true of all genres. So apocalyptic, the name, let's start with the name, comes from the most famous apocalypse ever written, and that's the book of Revelation, which of course is a Christian apocalypse, but it is an apocalypse. This is its Latin name. Its Greek name is apocalypse, the apocalypsis, and it means to uncover or to reveal, which tells us something about the nature of their thought and their writing. Something about it is uncovering or revealing. But the name comes from the book, the most famous book, apocalyptic book ever written. When we talk about giving you examples of apocalyptic, just to, get us in line, one of the most famous apocalyptic groups from the ancient world were the people who inhabited Qumran. Christianity is an apocalyptic religion. We also see, again, throughout time, into the modern world, the influence of apocalyptic thought on all sorts of groups that have been influenced by a Jewish or Christian way of thinking. So if you're old enough, you may remember David Koresh and the group in Waco, Texas, and their fight out with the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms crowd. This was an apocalyptic movement. It was not Christian, but it was influenced by Christian thinking. Another an American apocalyptic group, which you may not even realize or think about, but this proves my point, the Ghost Dance movement of the Plains Indians in the late 1800s is a apocalyptic movement. So it can go from, Daniel, traditional biblical understanding to Christianity, to sort of fringe Christian groups, to groups that have just come under the influence of Christian thinking, or of maybe to put it in a better way, that have come under the influence of apocalyptic thinking. And so you can see all sorts of things, and it's really fascinating to me, once you have identified this way of thinking, how much it pops up in our culture and in our rhetoric, both in secular and religious spheres. So let us move on then. I want to look. I've got two handouts that you have up, they're available to you. They overlap. So the first one is, I want us to look at, is the apocalyptic, a multifaceted phenomenon. So first we're going to look at the phenomenon of apocalyptic, including the literary, and then I want the second handout, I want to expand on the literary aspects of the apocalyptic genre. Okay, so get that first handout out. So if I can get my pen to work. Okay, there we go. So there's a lot of information packed into this one piece of paper, or one page. So go with me. I'll go slowly, and then this is also the time to write down questions, and our discussion board will definitely, I hope, help us to clarify all questions and concerns. So first, like I said, apocalyptic is a very multifaceted phenomenon. So you can think about poetry, you can think about short stories, murder mysteries, genres that don't come with particular ways of viewing the world. But that's not the case. Apocalypses, which is the literary genre, clearly are developed by a particular group or particular way of thinking. And apocalypses very, very often, most often produce groups, apocalyptic groups. So you will find that there are probably more apocalyptic groups than there are actually apocalyptic writings. There are probably lots of writings that express a worldview of apocalyptic, but are not apocalypses. So let me say that again. It's such a multifaceted phenomenon. There are a large number of groups, let me put this over here, that show an apocalyptic worldview. Some of those groups produce apocalypses. But there are also a lot of writings that show apocalyptic influence. So we have lots and lots of examples. Okay? So groups that express a worldview that sometimes produce writings that can be called apocalyptic in their tone. So, let's start with the worldview then. One of the basic understandings of apocalyptic thinking is a linear view of history. So this is sort of history is a continuous movement in toward the future. And this idea that at some point in the future, an intervention, God will intervene, and the world will be a radically different world. So there's the current history, and think about this as beginning, or at least flourishing in the period of Antiochus. The future right now is very dismal. And that's probably a basic understanding of apocalyptic groups, that in some ways the present is not good. So you look forward to a future where God will intervene, and with this ultimate intervention, the world will ultimately change. The world will be different, and the people of God who have remained faithful will live in peace. So that's this idea of a linear view of history. Now we use the term millennial because that's often because of Revelation, the idea of the 1,000 years, the 1,000 year period from Revelation. So it just takes on this name. But if you want to think in terms of both a Christian and Jewish understanding of the linear nature of history, it's basically this. You have creation, and then the flood. The world before the flood or after the flood is qualitatively different than the world after the flood. And, God allows the creation to go forward, but with a very strong sense that it is not what it should have been, what God meant it to be. And so we are now living, or for if you were Jewish, you would now be living in the period after the flood, before the end. The image of the flood is a central image of apocalyptic literature. It both cleanses and destroys. So you get from God's good creation, remember Genesis 1, corruption. God purifies the world, destroys the corruption, and starts again. And then in the current time, when things are so unhappy, we believers hope for the end of time, when God's intervention will ultimately put everything back in its proper place. The wicked will be punished, the pure of heart, the faithful will be rewarded. Now in Christianity, let me run out of space here. In Christianity, we have the same idea of creation, the corruption that leads to the flood. So these are, you've probably heard of maybe the term dispensations or millennial periods. This is what they are. And they get a lot more complicated in some circles. The flood. Then we have the flood to the death and resurrection of Christ. So this, for the Christian, means we are living in a qualitatively, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively different period of time than what life was like before the death and resurrection of Christ. And we are then waiting for the second coming. So this is how this idea of millennials play out. And of course, you get, if you follow much of the book of Revelation, you've got premillennial, post-millennial. It all has to do with that reference to the 1,000-year period that Satan will be bound. And as I learned in seminary, and I don't tell a lot of jokes, but I'm a pan-millennialist. I'm not a premillennialist or post-millennialist. I'm a pan-millennialist because I believe it'll all pan out in the end. So there's my one joke for you for the day. So this is the Christian view. The Jewish view would be just like this without the idea of the death and resurrection. And then, of course, you can put in all these weird groups over time that base it on this sort of thinking and put something else in here, whether it was David Koresh, whether it was Wovoka for the ghost dance or whatever. So, with me. So, to go back then, again, emphasize this radical intervention from another world. So this change of history is not from inside history, not inside, but from outside. Again, the sense of God. It's got to be God. But also a part of this is this idea of dualism. And dualism is I've got the word up here several times. Dualism is the idea of poles or opposites. So Christianity is a dualistic religion. We believe in moral or ethical dualism. We believe in a spiritual. Often people talk about spiritual dualism, good versus evil. This is where these ideas come from. That's what I mean when I say dualism. So this period of creation where there was corruption, where the forces of evil began to prevail. God cleansed the world and purified it in the flood. The corruption began again. In the Christian understanding, Christ comes to save us from this corruption, and we await now the second coming. So this is the idea of the worldview. So if you have any questions on that, I want to then, before we go back to the literary genre, talk about the social phenomenon. So again, these groups, which are much larger in number than actual apocalypses, written documents, there are views that understand the world in this way. The thing about apocalyptic is that it does tend to form coherent groups or cohesive groups because, and here it comes to the idea of knowledge. Revelation, to uncover, to reveal, because what defines an apocalyptic group, the phenomenon, is that they have knowledge that has been revealed or uncovered to them that the rest of the world doesn't. And so this is sort of central to, and what that is, we'll talk a little bit about more too. But so this idea of knowledge or being uncovered creates sort of a separation of them from the larger society to a greater or lesser degree. So depending on level of organization, it will have personnel. We go from very, very disorganized groups to Christianity, which is definitely very much an ordered religion. And each group will have a different understanding of the way that the new world, when this divine intervention occurs, what it will look like. So again, to go back to one you may not have been aware of, but like the ghost dance of the U.S. Plains Indians was the return of the buffalo and the depending on whose branch of it you were talking about, the destruction of the whites, the Europeans. So they saw that this through the ghost dance, that there was a Christian element to it, but in this whole restoration period, this is what you'd get out of it. So their ideal is what they believed would be the qualitative change. So they have orders of personnel. They'll be changed. Their goals will be realized through a timetable of revealed events of both past and future. And so this is, again, another element of the knowledge. So what, they have knowledge, but what is it? It's almost like they have the code to break history, to break or to understand historical events. So in a way, if you're familiar with Revelation, a lot of people read Revelation, it's sort of set up this way, that when we see these particular events come along, we know that we are seeing what has been revealed to us as a group. And we know, and that's another thing, and I think I didn't emphasize that earlier, for apocalyptic groups, the end of time is always close. And I'll take a step out and over here and talk about the role of persecution. Many apocalypses do have their roots in the fact that they were being persecuted. This may be the case for Revelation, for groups of in Daniel, because but there are many groups, even Christianity, that are apocalyptic in their views, even if there's not any real any actual persecution. But what we've come to think more is less persecution and more perceived lack in some way of, whether it be control, they feel like they're slipping away. You could think about, some groups in the United States that talk about how, we don't have the power to control our lives anymore. So they perceive that they are being persecuted, but it's really more of a perception than a reality. So let me say that again. A perceived loss, of lack or loss, is enough to create an apocalyptic group without any actual persecution taking place. You go back to, if you look up David Koresh and the Waco crowd, one wonders if that would have ended up in a fiery destruction if the ATF hadn't actually been feeding right into their perceived sense of persecution by actually persecuting them by laying siege to the compound. So there's another interesting thought about how sometimes modern history and understanding ancient things can help you understand the world a little bit better. So anyway, having said that, gone off on a rabbit's trail there for a second, the idea, again, as always, this goes back to that's what I was talking about, the imminent. So what is going on now are the signs of the end. And as I say, people who have predicted the end of the world up to this point are batting zero. So every time that people have predicted that this is it, whether from my childhood, whether it was the Soviet Union and, it's the Great Bear, whether, 1,000 years ago, whatever it was, there's always somebody and something that some group of people will see as an imminent threat. So, again, questions. The groups then, they do form cohesive groups, but sometimes they're more like clubs, that in the sense that they meet on regular intervals. Sometimes they actually separate from the world, and depending on how organized they are, there will be a great deal of special rituals that will be performed as part of this group. So passive, there's some form of organized group life, but that can be, like I said, just occasional meetings for sharing. To very, very ones where you just change your whole life to be a part of that group. And so also then we get back, to this armed conflict or martyrdom. Apocalyptic groups, even some of the most active apocalyptic groups, we cannot necessarily predict which direction that they'll go in terms of whether, when provoked, they will choose martyrdom, or whether another apocalyptic group might actually then issue a call to arms and fight against their perceived the oppressors, the perceived oppressors. Again, I think I said this in an earlier lecture, the biblical apocalypses, all of them argue for a passive response. The biblical apocalypses do not call for conflict or armed conflict. So that's just something that is very, very clear. Okay, so again, sometimes highly unethical behavior, sometimes highly ethical. Of course, the Jewish ones that we're going to be studying are all of this sort, but if you study apocalyptic groups throughout time, you'll find some that are a whole lot more in this, because really it doesn't matter. That's the point. We're close to the end of time. And again, like I've already said, not all groups that exhibit an apocalyptic worldview produce apocalypses. So, we have dealt with this. So let's go back up, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction to this idea of, and some terminology. And then the other handout that you've got is, I'm going to get a little more technical and go straight to the basic definition that most people use when we talk about apocalyptic literature. So let's start with this idea of dualistic language, two opposing moral forces. It's always a this versus that. Us versus them. Good versus evil. So, and especially in the Jewish and Christian apocalypses, it's the good and evil is conceived of both in spiritual and moral terms. So it is also metaphysical, because this duality of language continues. Two moral forces is not just something on earth, but you have the duality of the earth. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. You have the duality of you have a heavenly world and an earthly world. So what's going on in the earthly world can be mirrored in the heavenly world. So if there's warfare on earth, then you can be guaranteed that there are angelic forces in heaven also fighting that same battle. So this dualistic or dual worlds. So again, Apocalypse talks about or advocates or believes in God coming in the near future. So most apocalypses will in some way either, there are different kinds of apocalypses, but the historical apocalypses, the ones that deal with the future, always have us very close to the moment when when God will break in. So all apocalypses, full-blown apocalypses, are visions. So the belief that God reveals through visions instead of directly. The idea of the transcendence of God is very important in apocalyptic thinking. We see it comes in under the Persian influence with the angels and the demons. This is all a part of Persian religion that seems to have had a strong influence on Jewish understanding, but this nameless, faceless sons of man that we hear referenced in the Old Testament become an active body of legions of beings with names and agendas and ranks and all that. And all this is part of the fact that God, you go back to Genesis 2, where God is walking and talking in the garden, and that's an ancient story. But as you go forward in history, theologically, the people of the Bible become more and more, place more and more emphasis on the fact that God is transcendent, and that we as human beings deal with God through these intermediaries. Okay. So, you with me? Then, get this right. I wanted to spend a little time on these two terms as well. Now, predestination, you'll find both of them in this material. The idea that something is predestined or is decided beforehand. So we talk about in Christianity a little bit, we talk about predestination versus free will. We talk about it in terms of salvation, if someone is predestined to be saved or not predestined to be saved. But so it's really can be a little confusing to take this term and go backwards. It means the same thing, but we need to distinguish predestination from determinism, which is probably a better term for expressing what apocalyptic literature is all about. The decided beforehand versus the future is determined. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of difference, maybe, but the difference where it really comes down to in determinism has to do with the individual versus the group, and also the level of freedom. That obviously is an issue of freedom here. First of all, let's talk about the idea of freedom. In many apocalyptic writings, especially the evil forces have a great deal of freedom to show their cruelty and their evil, and their actions are not decided beforehand. So because clearly their level of cruelty is such that you really don't want to attribute that to God. So if that makes sense. So the idea of predestination in the sense of every aspect of it, point, is determined beforehand, is a little problematic, especially in apocalyptic, where the evil forces are doing some terrible things to the people of God. So the idea of that intense Calvinistic predestination isn't what's going on here. The cruelty is not from God. So these individuals, these groups must have had some of their own free will. So that's the issue of free will. Individual versus group, what is determined is the group. And I would argue in some ways predestination in the New Testament is more about the church than it is about any individual in the church. So the future is determined. You and I, we have the decision to make. We're going to be either on the side of good or the side of bad. And the fate of these are determined. God is in control. No doubt about it. But for the time being, God allows a level of freedom. You and I are given a level of freedom where we choose a side, and we are then our future. So the future is determined but not predestined in the sort of Calvinistic understanding. So, again, questions. But it's also, let me sort of do that again. The future of God's people is determined. So we could say as Christians, the future of the church. But individuals within that are free to choose sides. And this is partly a theodicy. It explains the problem of evil. Because the forces of evil are so cruel, and they persecute God's people. How can that be from God? So to say predestination, that's why, again, determinism, forces of evil are cruel, and their choices are not God's choices. So individually, we are determined. Individually, we are free to make choices, but the course of history is determined, and you can either get on the bandwagon or you can be left behind. Okay. So, symbolism and coded terms. This is one of the sort of a simplistic misunderstanding of apocalyptic literature, is that it is symbolic. We go all the way back, this history of the symbolic vision in the Bible, which begins, like I said earlier, so early, 8th century, with Amos and a basket of summer fruit. And we go through the prophetic visions till we end up, there's a direct relationship between prophecy and apocalyptic. And in apocalyptic visions, this symbolism, these symbolic visions are just taken to a whole new level. So again, it's when you see something like the 4 beasts rising out of the waters of chaos in Daniel 7, these are symbols. In this case, they're symbols of nations. There's also a sense of coded terms, so that, there's sort of a language of apocalyptic, if you want to put it that way, that once you sort of read enough of them, you can sort of get the sense of some things that appear over and over again. And so, if that makes sense. So you've got the symbols of the 4 nations, the nations, the 4 nations, but you've got 4, which is a similar symbolic coded term, numerology with like 666 in Revelation and things like that. So there are all sorts of ways. It used to be said that this was to hide the message from the persecutor. Again, when we had a more less nuanced view of apocalyptic, and said if apocalyptic arises out of persecution, then the symbolism is because you need to hide the message from the evil forces because you're being persecuted. No, more it's, like I said, perceived persecution, which then, and it's apocalyptic is based on sort of revealed knowledge that, I as a member of the group have, that someone who wasn't a member of the group didn't have. So it's less that we're hiding the message than the fact that only the faithful can understand it. It's a sign of being faithful that you can understand the message, that you are part of the initiated. So even the best laid plans, even professors have their cell phones go off in the middle of class sometimes. So apologize for that. But to get back to perceived persecution, it's more the idea of an insider-outsider rhetoric that aren't we special because we understand the message, and the rest of those people, they don't. And so they must be on the outside. So there's an insider-outsider rhetoric to it that really makes a whole lot more sense than just the idea of we have to hide it from the evil people who are persecuting us. So finally, there are angels, highly elaborate understandings of angels and demons and messianic figures, which over the course of the Second Temple period, the definition of Messiah is different for a lot of different groups, but these figures, sometimes earthly, sometimes heavenly, that and sometimes the angels are the messiahs that intervene and are God's do God's work on this earth. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can go on in the next recording to the just a more specific review of the actual definition of apocalyptic writing in Jewish literature.